And welcome to a conversation about electronic literature. I'm John McDaid with the National Writers Union Boston chapter. Welcome to all the members who've joined us on Zoom and who will be watching this later on our YouTube channel. We're going to spend about the next hour talking with two longtime practitioners of eLit. And the goal for today is to show some of the possibilities of the genre, explore some of the practical and theoretical issues of interest to writers, and have some time for questions. But mostly, this is a genre that I and our panelists are passionate about, and I hope that we can share some of the excitement we feel and maybe get other folks interested in trying out some of the possibilities. I'm going to ask our panelists, Professor Dene Grigar and Sarah Smith, to introduce themselves. But first, a word from our sponsor, as it were. The National Writers Union is the only labor union that represents freelance writers working in all genres, formats, and mediums, with over 1,300 members in 12 local chapters. We have members who are journalists, book authors, academics, poets, web content creators, and more. If you write and you're looking for a union that fights for independent writers, check out our website. We'll drop some links in at the end so you can find out more. Also wanted to acknowledge our siblings in the WGA who are on strike as we are recording this, and we offer our solidarity. I am delighted to have you all here. I've worked in the medium of hypertext since 1987 when I first saw a copy of one of the first tools for writers called Story Space, which is actually sort of still around these days, and wrote one of the first hypermedia novels, Uncle Buddy's Phantom Funhouse, using a Mac program called HyperCard, which sadly is not. But that has a lot to do with the work that Dene and her team are doing. So I am going to ask first Dene and then Sarah to introduce themselves and describe what they do.
And Dene is muted for some reason.
And I am going to see if I can ask you to unmute.
There we go.
There you go.
Hi, I'm a professor at Washington State University, Vancouver, and that's Vancouver in the United States, not the beautiful Canadian Vancouver. I direct the Creative Media and Digital Culture Department at the university, and since the 1990s, I've curated, preserved, created, conserved, and written about born digital media. It's my passion. I also co-founded and serve as a manager of and curator of the ELO's electronic literature organizations, The Next, and I direct the Electronic Literature Lab at the university. I'm curating an exhibition of hypertext art and writing in September at the Musei Capitolini in Rome, which I'm excited about. I also have a book in production that should be coming out this fall entitled Challenges of Born Digital Literature, Editions, Translations, and Emulations, which is co-authored with my colleague Mariusz Przyrski from Poland. It's for Cambridge and University Press. It examines activities, approaches, and strategies underlying the preservation of born digital literature. Thank you, John and Barbara, for inviting me.
Awesome. Sarah?
Hi, I'm Sarah Smith. I write stuff. I have 6 novels out on paper or on electrons, and I also wrote one of the early hypertext, supposedly the first science fiction hypertext, King of Space, which has been turned into a modern readable hypertext by Dene's group, for which I am intensely grateful. My day job is as a developer of educational software, and we may have some things to say about the relationship between educational software and hypertext fiction.
Cool. Well, just to get started, for folks in our audience who are all writers, but who may not be familiar with this particular genre, either Sarah or Dene, how would you define electronic literature, and what are some of the features, what makes something electronic literature?
Sarah, do you want to go first?
Yeah. Dene, are you going first?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I see Born Digital works. They're works that feature participatory, interactive, and experiential qualities. John's Uncle Buddy's Phantom Funhouse and Sarah's King of Space are both great examples of this genre.
So
Um,
participatory, interactive, and experiential. Okay,
I
Sarah.
call it pie.
Hi. Okay.
uh, that she said, obviously, to add to that, they are created using hypertext linkages, but sometimes programmed linkages, and they are meant to be read on the computer or on your phone, which decreasingly makes them different from other things that we read on the computer or on our phone, such as Wikipedia. Um,
Hmm.
there are standards and critical theories about hypertext fiction, and we're still trying to find out what they are.
Nancy Kaplan was my teacher at the University of Texas at Dallas that taught me about hypertext. She explained it as literature you just can't print out it just can't print out. It just doesn't make any sense to print. You can't, and then when you do, it just doesn't make any sense.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very different than maybe an ebook, because an ebook you can print. They usually show up as print-based novels. But something like John McDaid's Uncle Buddy's Funhouse, can't print that out very easily. I've seen the manuscripts for some of these works, like yours, Sarah, and they just don't make sense without the whole experience of pie-ness, I call it.
Yeah, they're based on a structure, which is not the structure that starts here and goes there.
Yeah.
They're based on a structure of multitudinous branches and loops and whirls. And John, your Uncle Buddy's Phantom Funhouse is one of the most beautifully complex pieces of that kind of work I have ever seen, and I just can't wait to read it again. And also, they don't necessarily have easily defined edges. That was one of the issues that we had in early hypertext, that your readers wanted to go here, and then they wanted to go here, and then they wanted to go here, but you hadn't programmed beyond this space, and so they're groping for the edges of the narrative.
And that would be very familiar to gamers these days.
Mhm.
That's the kind of constrained space when you're walking through and you see, okay, this wall looks like it will yield. These walls, not so much.
Mhm.
But this is something that I'm hearing you say it was baked into the medium from the very beginning, even before we added the levels of 3D interaction and game narrative.
Yeah, in a way, some kinds of interaction are like games with fewer images.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm reminded of Theodore or Ted Nelson used to talk about, he was the person who coined the term hypertext back in the 1960s, and used to talk about linear fiction as one possible pathway through a hypertext space. So one way for writers, for print writers who will be watching this, to think about hypertext fiction might be to say, imagine the linear book as one possible pathway, one, as Dene says, one printable pathway through a fiction. Whereas outside of that singular pathway are all of these possibilities to explore.
Let me mention my early days, and when I was studying with Nancy, we were using Story Space software, which your work, Sarah, was built with, right?
No, we were actually pre-Story Space. Mark had to write a new programming language for King of Space.
Yeah, so when I was working with Nancy, what we'd do is we'd write into these nodes, and then you can actually move these nodes around, and you could print them out. So when you developed your text inside these little boxes, you would arrange them on the screen of the computer and you'd print them. Then you would rearrange them and print them again. And we kept doing that and then reading the work as we rearranged the text. And it got us to be able to think about what it means to write a work that has multiple ways of reading. It's something that as a print writer, I didn't think about. I would just start with the big, I would plan something, but the work itself unfolded, the Freytag pyramid kind of thing, right? Got to be a climax in there, got to be conflict. And but with hypertext, it can come anywhere. It's real interesting.
Yeah, I think from the writer's point of view, even more so than in print fiction, you try to fill every rift with ore, every node with something entertaining and interesting, because you don't know who is going to spend that amount of time there. I once was present when John McCarthy was reading King of Space, and John McCarthy was told that there was a whorehouse somewhere in King of Space, and he wanted to go there. He wanted to go there quick, and that was the only thing he was interested in. So that's one reading, and then there were many, many, many different readings.
And for the folks who are print people in our audience, this is not something that's completely new. There have been experimental works in fiction, folks like Robert Coover, Borges, Cortázar's Hopscotch is an early example of fiction that it was multilinear in an attempt to escape that single track through the text. So it's not something that even print writers are completely unfamiliar with.
And to go back to Sarah's comment, I think what happened after I started creating story space work, right, my own hypertext, is I became a better disciplined writer in the print, because it made me realize that no matter where somebody entered a text, it had to grab them. In your print writing, you wanted the same effect, but yeah.
Right. And I think, Sarah's point about stuffing every particular place with ore, in science fiction, we have a term of art called eyeball kicks. And you always try to have, at least one of those per page, just to keep the narrative interest going. And so that's, again, it's not something that even print writers have been unfamiliar with.
In Michael Joyce's Afternoon of Story, if you're just simply hitting the return key, the second lexia is, I think I saw my son die this morning. It just jolts you. It just jolts you, right? But if you don't use that return key, and if you just click on various links, you'll eventually get to that, but after you only experience these other aspects of the story. But when you do get to that lexia, it changes your whole perspective of this character's, what I would say, maybe not so great behavior.
Right. For those who are unfamiliar, Afternoon, a story by Michael Joyce, is generally regarded as the premier work of hypertext fiction. It is probably the first thing that was written using story space. I believe that they used story space. They tested story space by having Michael write this novel using it. It was the lead in Robert Coover's New York Times piece on hypertext literature back in 1993.
Can I say something, John? Michael Joyce created story space because he wanted to write a novel that no one had ever been able to write before and read it over and over again a different way. That was the point of it. And he sought out folks that would help him. So he found John B. Smith and J. David Bolter, and the three of them colluded to build this software program. And yeah, Michael's work was the test case. And when Mark Bernstein saw that at the 1987 Hypertext Conference at Chapel Hill, he fell in love with it and licensed it. So when he did release the first work on Eastgate's premature printing, it was Story Space, Michael Joyce's Afternoon Story. So anyway, it's a really interesting history that a print author developed this software to do this experimental work. And that's the genius of Joyce.
And just to put it in a slightly larger historical context, these ideas, Ted Nelson, who originated the term hypertext, came up with this in the 1960s, building on work that goes back at least as far as 1945, when FDR's science advisor, Vannevar Bush.
1965 was the date. John, okay, you froze for a second.
Okay, 65, hypertext. 1945 was when the idea of using technology to create multilinear paths was at least talked about in an article in The Atlantic by Vannevar Bush.
Mm-hmm. So we've had this stuff for 80 years. And as fiction writers, we're only beginning to scratch the surface of it now.
Well, it's not surprising. I mean, the printing press was invented in 1456, but it took 50 years for page numbers to be invented. So new media will require new affordances and new skills for writers, and that's a lot of what we're here to explore today. Would you sorry, go ahead, sir.
I think that we should talk about a piece of this that is very new and different for writers, at least writers who haven't already been involved in collaborative projects. It is extremely natural for a hypertext to be a collaborative work. And that's not only because they're big, but because you have this problem of the edge. And if you have readers who can also be writers, they can expand the edge. The way that Wikipedia has expanded and expanded and expanded until you can look into Wikipedia and find really bizarrely obscure things that somebody realized was not in this world, so they made it. And also, as Dene can talk about much better than the rest of us, there are different skills that go into creating a hypertext. And when we did King of Space in 88, I think, roughly, starting 88, it took a long time, there were 4 people involved. Mark Bornstein for the programming, me for the text, Matthew Mattingly, who did the illustrations, and Michael Brzezinski, who did the music. And there were about 36 people involved in the redo of King of Space this past year.
Yeah, there were 36 of us on that team to reconstruct it. It was huge. Managing that I was a project manager for it, and oh my gosh, just trying to keep all those teams working to reconstruct it. But yeah, I think but one thing I'll say is that when I think about electronic literature, we start with hypertext, and then it morphed into net art because of Flash. I mean, I'm just in love with Flash poetry. I just have to say that. But now we have video poems that people make with their phones. I was in Dubai for the Arabic Electronic Literature Conference in 2017, and I was awestruck by the amount of work that was being produced by colleagues in the Arab world that were produced with phones, right? So phone technology. And so this brings up the notion that, people are making this art right now easily without even knowing that they're electronic literature artists and writers. And that's the beauty of it. And I would say that we're going to talk about this later. John's got a question coming up about what it takes to be this kind of artist. I would say the power's in your hands. There are some issues that you need to know.
And just to build on, I think there are just to unpack a little bit, I think there's at least 2 important things that you just said. One is that even an individual work can have a large team, but then there's also enormous fictive universes like SCP, which is an entire Wikipedia devoted to anomalous entities that is collaboratively created. And it's all fiction. This is hypertext fiction, but as you say, it's people who are constantly pushing any edge that they find, that they say, oh, I can write some more about that. You know, the notion of fandom and the ability to, you know, like an archive of our own, or AO3, as people talk about, the ability to enter into these spaces as a writer creates a distributed team, if you will, creating these works that are much larger than any human could.
I'd like to add on that to Martha and Linda and Barbara and Susan. What I'd like to say to the four of you is that unless we lose electricity, we'll see the growth of this field. There will be incredible growth in this because of the way in which these technologies are unfolding. This past semester, my students readapted Rob Sweigert's Portal game from 1986 into a VR narrative. So VR is another area, and you know, with AR and AI and all these things are going to happen. So as long as we have electricity, there's going to be growth in this field.
And as long as Dene's team is working to stabilize and keep these works in print, and I want to talk about what you and ELO and others are doing in that area as well, because one of the issues is the impermanence of these electrons.
Well, let me just add something before we move on to the impermanence of electrons. A large subject. I actually make my living in my day job by creating educational software, which is not fiction, but is definitely hypertext. And the students in the college generation now see nothing anomalous about opening their textbook, which is an electronic textbook, and solving problems within the textbook, and seeing videos within the textbook, and this is and going from place to place, searching for things. This is hypertextual, and it's baked into what we are doing now. Now let's talk about.
No, I just to build on that, I one wonderful quote from Mark Bernstein is, and Dene, I think you were there for this, when he said the link is the first new punctuation mark that's been invented in 500 years.
Yeah.
Which I think is just, it's a very interesting spin and an interesting way to think about it, because it's the writerly impulse channels itself through media. We are all writers, and this generation is just finding these media to channel their creativity through in different ways.
Let me mention that I'm putting together this exhibition for Rome next fall, and I have this whole section called Beyond the Click. Because in the late 1990s and early 2000s, we were getting tired of clicking on a screen, right? We all get tired of like click, click, click. And it becomes really tedious over a course of time. And people begin to experiment with ways to move beyond the click. And so one of the works I'm showing, actually I can't show it because it's dead tech. It involved a headset that you would wear, and it had a place under your nose, had a little thing that went underneath your nose, and you'd breathe into it. And you would breathe, and the work would progress, and you'd navigate through the work by breathing.
Whoa.
It was so frigging cool. And the work Breathing Wall by Kate Pullinger, very famous ELIT artist. You all probably know her, John and Sarah, but this was her response to I'm tired of clicking. And mine was working in a 3D environment, you know, touching things that were like images that would appear in the air, right, using this technology. in my lab, and I was working through this kind of 3D space. Other people like Eric Lawyer was using the iPad, and you'd move the iPad like this and things would happen. And so
like Minority Report.
Yeah. So you would move this around and you shake it and things would change, right? And so people are always, I mean, the thing I love about artists, and this involves all of you that are in this room, the thing I just say about artists is that you're heroes. You are heroic for many reasons, but one of which that I think is just the most amazing is that you can look at a medium and find ways to push it to the limit. I just am always in awe of that brilliance. And this is what writers do. This is the height of art, right? And that's why I gravitate to people like John and Sarah. Sarah, 1988, King of Space. Oh my God, what a cool work that is. And John, Uncle Buddies.
Speaking of which, Sarah, would you like to show a couple? I think it might be helpful to ground folks if you wanted to show a couple of screens.
You know, why don't we just keep the conversation going, because it's so interesting.
Okay.
But anyone who wants to look at King of Space, it is at kingofspace.org. And
we'll drop these links in at the end, so people will have them.
But I wanted to add a couple of things to what Dene is saying. First is that as soon as Mark realized the power of the link, he invented conditionalized links, which we're only now just getting, and they're easy to program. I've just been programming some.
For those who may not be familiar, what we call a hypertext link now, the idea that you click on something and you go someplace else in a very unary fashion. You click this, it always goes there. That is one subtype of links that were thought of by hypertext theorists in the 80s and 90s. There were many different kinds of link structures, and Sarah is talking about one of them called conditional links, where the link itself can have intelligence built in that says something like, if you've been to place A and place B, then go here. That's not something that we have by default in contemporary what we call hypertext HTML. But it is possible to do that.
John, I just dropped a link to Sarah Smith's performance of the original King of Space.
Oh, perfect.
That will go with the new version that we've produced. I'm going to drop the link in for your performance of Funhouse in the original version, so people will have that if they want to look at it.
Perfect. And we'll have all these links. We'll put them all in a little package at the end.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to add, and we still haven't talked about the fragility of electrons, that thinking about the different ways that people can interact with fiction now. I love the idea that people with differences in perspective or perception, or differences in ability to speak or see or move their hands, are equalized by these interfaces.
I think that's a really important point, because we have spent a lot of time, many of us in the last few years, understanding accessibility and the appropriate standards for the web, and all of that absolutely applies to fictional environments as well.
One of the things we're doing in the lab is we're experimenting. We've actually produced metadata descriptions for works, so that if you are disabled in any way, you will know exactly what you need to do in order to understand this work, or to receive this work. So, for example, if something like Eric Lawyer's Reuben and Lullaby requires you to move this shake this mobile device, and you don't have access to, you can't use your hands, you need to know that in advance. And this isn't just for disabled people like who don't have hands. It's like anybody can break their arm. So Our stance is everybody's disabled at some point in their life. We all face disabilities. Without my glasses, I really couldn't see you right now.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't always this way. So, I mean, it's just a normal thing that happens to human beings, and we're addressing that now in the lab.
Yeah, and I'm
as
yep, go
as
ahead.
far as education goes, accessibility is a state mandated standard. So
Yeah,
it's very exciting what we have the ability to do.
and it's only going to get more interesting if people have seen the debut of Apple's new headset. The idea is it literally does eyeball tracking. So where you look is what is focused on, and then you have a variety of interface options from there. But the idea of an entire work wrapping around a user and allowing them to interact with it through looking.
Yeah. 5 years ago, this was an experimental technique. Now you can buy it from Apple.
If you've got
$34.
very large check.
For a very large sum. Yes.
John, do you want to talk about, I mean, I was going to say one of the things I wanted to mention was that electronic literature, or born digital literature, I call it, and I mentioned this to John in my notes, is that it's the opera of our times. And if you're a fan of opera, you'll get what I'm saying. But I love going to an opera because there's image, there's performance, there's music, there's sounds, there's a color, there's image. I mean, it's so rich, it's so sensory rich. So as a child, I was completely fascinated by opera. That's what happened with electronic literature for me. The fascination is exactly the same. I'm totally fascinated by all these media, these sensory modalities coming together in this one media experience. That's what I mean by experiential. It just takes me in, and it makes it immersive. And one thing I'll say about this is that there was a writer, an author that came out with a book called Hamlet on the Holodeck, Janet Murray, in which she takes apart electronic literature and says, oh, it's never going to work because you have to like do something in order to, experience the work. So and when you read a book, you just turn the page and you just don't even think about it, right? You just turn the page. So immersion for her was tied to non-trivial activities, which was the coin of the realm for print.
Mm-hmm.
But the coin of the realm for electronic literature, born digital literature, is immersion. It's immersion. It's being able to immerse yourself in these sensory modalities. So it's a different way of thinking about producing a text and what a text is. So for those in the field, it's text is anything that can be brought down to zeros and ones.
Yeah, I knew Janet and was talking to her about that before Hamlet on the Holodeck came out, and I mentioned that in fact you are doing things when you're reading. You're moving your eyes, you're processing data, you're flipping pages, and that technology is invisible to us because we're so used to it. And if you're 20, 15, 10 now, you're used to the idea that you create videos the way you create a story. You click, of course you click, or you tap it with your finger, or you swipe, and all of that is transparent in the same way.
Right. And the, folks who grew up in this generation think nothing of mixing images and text in memes.
Mm-hmm.
They think nothing of creating what we would have called in the 1980s postmodern pastiches. But they wouldn't use that language. They just will pull everything together that seems to fit and turn it into, as Dene says, an opera in its highest form, or
Retta.
Icon has cheeseburger at its most basic.
watching my nephew play in the early days, watching my nephew years ago play video games. He'd be like busy playing this game with the console. His hands are just moving all over this console. He's watching, and then all of a sudden he'd hit a part of the console and the story would stop, and then he'd choose a sword, like choose his weapon, right? And he'd pick the weapon, and then he'd go back to the story, and then he'd go a little bit further. Oh, now he's going to choose his power, and he's going to jump, or he's going to be, able to do something, and he chooses that when he goes back and plays. And I asked him, I said, when you do this thing where you break out from the story, do you lose your concentration? I mean, that's essentially what immersion is, right? Concentration. He said, what do you mean? Of course not. I know exactly what I'm doing. And that is what the difference is between a lot of my students today and my generation, because I'm 68, so I have been around a long time. Our concentration was focused on the page, on what's happening on the page. And so their concentration is focused on in a much broader array of spaces.
And I would be remiss if I did not mention Marshall McLuhan at this point, because the history of communication technologies has gone through these three phases, through oral, literate, and now this digital world. And each of these takes the affordances of the medium as laws of nature. Socrates himself said that print would destroy civilization. It seems not to have. But here we are going through the same kind of shift that Greece experienced and that Europe experienced in the 1500s.
Yeah. And every time there's a new technological development in the ways in which you can narrate a story, the idea of the story changes. And the relationship between the author and the reader changes. And it's wonderful.
Absolutely. I mean, do you think it's accidental that we see so many stories about the multiverse? That's
absolutely not.
That's where we are. We're in a period of time in this media environment.
I'll say the next phase. So we've been talking about, orality, in writing, the post-writing period that we're in. I would say the real demarcation is happening with Apple's, Apple, and that is we're moving off the page, we're moving off a surface and onto the air, right? There's not going to be a surface to write on. There's going to be a different way of writing in the future, and that is in this kind of ephemeral space. And so the loss of surface is going to be the big change and the way we have to rethink.
Right. And it's not that the surfaces go away. It's not that it's never, as McLuhan says, new media never replace old media. What they do is they reconfigure their role in the overall ecology. So even in the demos that Apple did of their new headset, there are pages, quote unquote, pages of print that you look at, but they cast shadows on your coffee table. But for writers who are more experienced with linear narratives, how can they, what advice would you have for the folks who are watching this and saying, I might want to dip my toe in? What should they be thinking about? How should they be approaching it? Do you have any guidance, suggestions?
I would say get another medium. You got to play with it. You got to understand it, And my mother was a painter. She painted in oils. And so the analogy I use is that if you imagine that you'd have to paint with oils after years of working with pencil on paper, there's a different medium. So the canvas my mother would use was very different than the notepad paper, the sketch pads that she'd sketch on. And then when she would shift to the mural, because she could also produce murals, she had to prepare that surface differently. So she had an understanding of each of the mediums that she worked in and what kind of paint would function best on these different mediums. So a writer of print would need to experience some of these works in these new mediums to get a sense of what it can do and where they can push it. Like I said, it helped a lot when I was working with Nancy to work around these story space lexias and create text inside stories, little stories inside of these parts of the story, and then reconfigure them and break up the linearity that was in my brain. I was inculcated with linearity, breaking that up and getting me to see a new way of thinking, and then adding that to opera and all these other things I had already experienced helped a lot. So just know the medium and play around with it, read it, experience it.
Start small and simple, and then figure out what seems to work for you, and keep playing with it.
And I think
it's been a long while since most of us learned how to write, and it's more of that process of learning how to write in a different way. Dene, what programs would you suggest to people?
I would start with Twine. It's an easy program to use. You don't know how to code to make a Twine. It's good if you learn a little bit of coding. You can really make a really kind of cool, crazy Twine. But to get started, Twine is free. It's easy to use. It's drag and drop. And it's a good way to start thinking about the medium. I would recommend that first.
And just
I mean, say a lot of the ones you were using before are gone. Flash, Muse, Direct, all of those are gone. But Twine is open source, will not go away.
Yeah.
And anybody, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, John.
No, I was just going to say, just to build on what Twine does for those who are not familiar, and we'll have links in the chat afterwards. If you've ever edited a Wikipedia page, if you've ever said, I'm just going to put some square brackets around something, and that will, create a link to go someplace else, which is how you would edit in Wikipedia. It's a very familiar environment in Twine where you can write in linear sentences, insert some punctuation, and this punctuation will tell the system, hey, if I put some square brackets around this, create a new space and link to it. You don't have to create the links. It's done for you automatically. So those folks who are beginning to experiment with it don't have to learn a lot of coding.
Well, even the new Twine, you don't have to do that. They have now a toolbar. You just click on the toolbar and it does it for you. Another thing you can think about, I mean, Stephanie Strickland and Margie Lusenbrink are two of my, MD Coverly is her pen name, have experimented with slideshows. Excel, the software program, Excel program, just simple little, Microsoft tools, just a PowerPoint. You can produce that. If with your phone, you can make a video, and with the new tools on the iPhone, you can even have little words put on your video, and that becomes your video story. So there's all kinds of simple things. And I teach this in digital storytelling class that I teach. And we have a lot of English majors that aren't tech oriented. So I teach a lot of these things to them so that they can get a sense of how they can express themselves in this new medium.
I have to say, I'm not a huge fan of Twine. I do use it, but I like other programs as well. I like a mind mapping program of some kind. Tinderbox is a mind mapping program. Scapy is lovely and cheap, and so you can plan out the relationships among different nodes. Miro is collaborative. I also use a relational database to keep track of things. But then I am a software geek, and not everybody is a software geek.
But just to build on that, there are tools that many writers are already familiar with, like Scrivener.
Scrivener, yeah.
That use a model of index cards.
Yeah.
And index cards are one way to think about them is Lexia, where you can literally move them around on the screen. And so people may be doing some of this already and just not familiar with the terminology.
Another nice thing about Scrivener is that you can put in your links, and Scrivener automatically keeps track of them. Yeah, I do use Scrivener. I use various design programs because I like to have animated things, and so I have a photo program. I have a video editing program, which is really pretty good. We use it in software development for education. It's called Active Presenter, which lets you break your story into pieces the way that Excel does, and lets you link among the various pieces, and it has things like animation that
well, just to move on just a bit, because I see where we are in terms of time. A lot of this might seem challenging to folks who are traditional print writers, have a lot of experience writing linear texts. How does their experience of writing and shaping a narrative get changed in this medium, and what are the things that people should be aware of as possibilities and gotchas?
Linda has a question.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, let me, I'm going to unmute.
and Linda, you're muted.
Can we unmute?
Do we have to unmute Linda?
Yeah, there we go.
There you go.
What happens to language in this digital world? I mean, in the old linear writing, it was polishing language, specificity of language, weaving a story with the magic of language.
It's still there.
It's
Linda,
still there. It's absolutely
But
there.
it seems it's being crowded out by all this digital stuff. So is the focus not on language, but is the focus in the digital world on the greater experience, a greater experience of a story?
Enhancement. Think of it as enhancement. And
enhancement.
I think, yeah. So one of my favorite examples, and thank you for that question. That's such a great question. Tom Swiss is one of my favorite poets. And with his work, Shy Boy, right? He's telling this little poem about a boy who's beaten up in school by bullies, right? And he's really shy. And the writing is so gorgeous. It's so beautiful. But when he talks about, but the little boy feels like a ghost, like no one really sees him, the word ghost disappears. Right? And also in Robert Kendall's Faith, which is another great work of literature, when he talks about falling off his rocker, the whole line rocks. So these activities, these things that happen inside the medium are there to, I would say, celebrate writing, right? It doesn't just, if you look at, I mean, I mentioned Fallowfield to John, that work was meant to be a real readerly text, but the writing is there. It's you know, the alliteration, assonance. I even went as far as to even scan each line so it's got a poetic meter. At the same time, there's music, there's sound, there's visuals. All of that is meant to collude into a way of a new experience for the reader to take in those words in their heart, to make them feel awestruck by the word. Does that make sense?
I love I love musical theater, and one of the axioms of musical theater is that a song goes where speech has to stop. So you have the book, and then you reach a point where you just can't talk anymore, and then you go to song. And I think that's what Dene is getting at when she talks about it as opera. that these are opportunities for extending beyond, not replacing.
Mm.
You know, the book is still the book in a musical, but then there are opportunities for choreography and songs and lighting and effects and all these other things that enhance the experience of that book.
And you're saying that the person reading can take in all this enhancement and all these other experiences of the written word.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
It's almost like I hate to say it this way, but it's just like it gets into your bloodstream. I mean, it's like mainstreaming the word. It's the only way of experiencing.
That's a good way of
I hate to
expressing
say it
it.
that
then.
way because it's, you know, drugs language, but I mean, literally, I'm hit. I'm just hit by the word. The word that Kate Pullinger uses is gobsmacked.
Mm,
Gobsmacks her, which I think is a fantastic,
mm.
another weird way of just describing this stuff. But it really does just, it makes you just feel it so deeply in a way that, you know, cinema can do that. Cinema, music, I mean, it's so cool.
And I think we all feel when a new medium comes along, you know, my mentor, Neil Postman, used to say that you need three kinds of media theorists: people who will study the effect of the new medium, people who will look back at the old medium, and then people who will, I guess, warn everyone. But we're, you know, we are right to be a little cautious. So Linda, you know, it's a good question, because we see all around us the loss of what we think of as traditional rationality that comes from the linearity of print. And I think it's partially because we have not yet experienced enough time in this new medium to see what its true essence is going to be in terms of what is it considered to be truth, what is it considered to be properly constructed narrative form, in the same way that print has different narrative forms from cinema. So it's an uncomfortable time for sure.
Well, there's a certain loss in language usage, and I attribute that, or a certain change, shall I say, in language usage. And I attribute that a lot to, I have a large extended family, and I communicate with them all the time through text. And there are many that are under 30 years old, and they text sometimes in a language that is so curtailed that this aging woman kind of has a challenge to understand what they're trying to say. And I guess I just wonder about that. I wonder where we're going. Are we going in the direction of such major language change because technology has always affected language?
Yes.
From the time of the scrolls, and the development of the book and so forth. Historically, that is proven. And it just seems that digital is having an enormous impact on the language being used. And I'm being I guess I'm an old traditionalist. I guess you would call me that. I'm just concerned about, because there's a connection between clear language and clear thinking. And that is just something that I still think is still valid. But what you're describing, that this digital enhancement makes you feel it as well as think it, that you're feeling it, and that the language itself doesn't have to create the feeling or transpire the feeling, that you have all this other digital stuff to do that.
I like to say that I've been teaching now for 44 years, a long time. So I've watched this transition, this evolution of, you know, writing and thinking and all this stuff in the classroom. One thing I'll say, I would blame fax machines before I blame anything, because that really did change the way we were communicating early on. But at the same time, my students, they are so articulate.
Mm-hmm.
When you talk to them, even though when they text me, they may say BRB, be right back,
Mm-hmm.
or in my humble opinion, they might use shortcuts. But when I speak to them in the classroom or one-on-one in the mentoring sessions, they're extremely articulate and they have a real good grasp of language.
And how is that any different from Bright Helmeted Hector or the Wine Dark Sea or the other gnomic utterances that we see sprinkled through oral texts, which is the character that orality gives to texts that are holdovers in those old works? We're going to see these things develop. And what I talk with my students, I talk about code switching, that they live in an environment of memes and icons, and that's how they communicate. And they need to, if they want to participate in certain places, in certain kinds of conversations, here are some of the enabling tools and some of the things they need to understand in order to do that, because they're amphibians.
Yeah, yeah.
Linda, when I teach digital storytelling, which I do about every other semester, or this coming fall, to have Dina Larson teaching it, John and Sarah. I'm excited about that.
That's awesome.
So she's taking my place teaching it. But anyway, I teach the writing. So I teach it as literature, like how to write literature, and then elevate that through these other.
Okay.
And there's a whole lot of us teaching it that way.
Right.
The problem, I would say, Linda, and to all of you in the room, is that a lot of my colleagues in creative writing have rejected this kind of art form and have adhered to print, and that's at the damage of the future. Because if creative writing and literature, and I come from English and I know how the rejection works, right? I've had this experience through all my 30 years of higher ed teaching, 35 years. But the problem is that unless people who teach every day in the classroom begin to get a sense of this, we're really damaging the future. Because I want colleagues teaching this. I want them to say, here's how you can do this here. Here's how you can take this word and enhance it over here. Rather than saying, oh, that's not art, which I've heard many times, that doesn't count. Those kids are going to still make it. They're just going to make crap. And so I don't want them making crap. I want them to make beautiful things, brilliant things. And they can't learn that by just, out there in the wild. I mean, they maybe can, but it helps a lot to get that formal training that an program would offer.
Yeah.
This is the problem, is the rejection.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's also new and like there's all this, my concern is that there's so much input by this technology that I wonder if that affects the focus. That's just one of my concerns. But I think the kids can handle the input much better than us folks who are not born in the digital age. I think they handle it very effectively.
I encourage you to look at that link I dropped in here. It's to the Shy Boy piece I mentioned. So it was created in Flash software, which died on December 31st, 2020. But my lab has reconstructed it so that it's available. So if you click on the link, access through Ruffle, that's okay. Just do that because that's how we saved it. We Ruffle.
Okay.
But it's an example. It's a way to get your toe in the water. Get a sense of what the possibilities are and how the words are still so vibrant.
Yeah, that's good. I'm glad about that.
And I recognize that we're coming up on time. Does anybody have any other questions for Sarah and Dene before if you want to raise your hand? If not, I'm sorry, Barbara, let me unmute you. Barbara, you need to unmute.
Barbara, there you go.
Well, this was fascinating. I think I will have my son help me play around with this. And I'm also remember when I started to write on a computer rather than a typewriter. And I was concerned myself that I was writing worse because I could fiddle with what I already have rather than I used to have to write everything over and over, the whole thing over and over. And I haven't thought back on it and wonder whether my writing got better or worse just because of that very old change that I had to go through. But you reminded me of that.
Yeah, I remember that moment when I realized that I could take a piece of text from here, grab it like clay and put it there. And it's a different experience. The experience of writing in hypertext. And yet you bring to it of the things you know about writing, all of the things you know about connecting with the audience, and it's fun.
I
What
think
else can
that's
I
really
say?
important because that is who we are as an organization. We're an organization of writers. And even if all of the wildest dreams of the AI folks and the VR folks come to fruition and everybody can create their own virtual environments, they're not going to be writers. They're not going to be the kind of folks who are going to create the satisfying experiences because they will not have interrogated the process in a way that Dene teaches and that Sarah practices.
Well, I hope to write something sometime that's the equivalent of opera.
Well, Barbara, I'm going to say this. One of the most, my lab, we conserve these works. We also archive them. So I have 62 boxes of papers. Sarah Smith has sent me her collection of electronic literature. I have like lots and lots and lots of things. One of the most exciting things in the world is when an author gives me their files that show the process of their writing. So I have Rob Sweigert's manuscript that his hypertext that he sent in to Eastgate Systems for publication, and Diane Greco's editorial comments all the way through it. And I also then have the work that finally got published. And so part of the textual analysis that I do as a scholar is to look at what the author originally thought about and then how it became changed in this new environment. But these are not different things than what happens to you every day when you get your editor's notes back from any book you publish, right? So I love these items that I get, and I hold on to them because they're really exciting text to study.
Well, I want to respect our guests' time. We're at the hour, but I want to give Sarah and Dene the opportunity to, any closing thoughts? Where would you like people to go to see more of your work? Anything else you'd like to be sure we hear?
Sarah, you want to go first?
Oh, you go first, Dene.
I'm typing in a link here. So for the past 5 years, I've been pulling in as many, these works are ephemeral, right? Because the technology dies, we have to hold on to them. I became concerned about the loss of these works, John's work not being able to be read, Sarah's works. So 5 years ago, I got money from the Mellon Foundation, and I began taking the original files, the digital files, and holding on to them, right? With the Electronic Literature Organization is my organization. Now I have 3,000 works in this Next. And the Next is a museum/library/preservation space. And so there's thousands of works to explore there. I'm the curator and the manager of this space. My lab is where all the action happens. I have a team of 12 people that work with me on this project. And we're getting ready to re-release a new interface at the end of summer. So check it out again in August. But it does have a lot of things that you can look at and get a sense of what's out there. 3,000 works is nothing. There's millions more that I'm planning to get my hands on before I die. But this is
And-
my life, and I'll say that this has been my commitment. The minute my fingers touched the computer in 1985, I fell in love. And after Nancy Kaplan turned me on to Michael Joyce, I couldn't go back.
Mhm.
This has been my commitment since 1991.
And we are so grateful because it is due to Dene that so many of these works have been rescued. For years, no one could read King of Space because the technology was obsolete. For years, no one could read Uncle Buddy's Phantom Funhouse. And it's this woman, Dene Grigar, who has brought together so many of these things. Do go to the next. Do look at the huge variety of the ways that people use this technology, and then see if it gives you any ideas. It is a lovely thing to play around with, and you may find that it's something that you love to play around with. It's something that gives you ideas that you need to express. Do go to kingofspace.org. Also, I am delighted that Dene, among the other works that Dene put back together, is Thomas Dish's Amnesia, which I published the text and programming notes for. And if you want to read any of my stuff that isn't hypertext, I'm at sarahsmith.com. If you have any questions, you can get in touch with me there.
And I want to thank Dene and Sarah. This has been a delightful conversation. I think I hope it will be of interest to our members, and I hope that we will see things from our membership that we can't even anticipate, because when a writer, and we're all writers, gets a hold of a new tool, there's no telling where they're going to go.
Thank you.
That's very exciting to me.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, everyone. And we will be posting this link on the National Writers Union YouTube channel for on-demand viewing later. And we'll have all these links underneath it.
Will you have the chat as well? Because
Yes, I'm going to save the chat right now before I forget,
Super.
before we close the meeting.
And if you want to contact me directly, there's my home email address. And because I'm not teaching during the summer, so just contact me.
Thanks very much. This has been a great afternoon. Thank you, everyone, for joining. And on behalf of the National Writers Union, thank you, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.